Al was convinced that the brains behind this attempted hit was Jaime Weiss, leader of the O'Banian gang, and he immediately ordered the death of this man. The hitmen set themselves up across from Weiss's flower shop and waited, and waited, and waited. After a week, they finally spotted Weiss walking towards his shop. They killed him and 3 of his bodyguards successfully. Stepping into the vacuum created by the killing of Jaime Weiss was Bugs Moran, who was as eager to get rid of Capone as Weiss had been. Moran had plenty of guts, but little common sense. He publicly denounced Capone, especially for peddling bad women and bad alcohol. Constantly on the attack, Moran's troops launched a number of forays against Capone's businesses. By February of 1929, Capone had had enough. He ordered a massive hit on Capone to take place on St. Valentine's Day. The killers, disguised as policemen, entered Moran's warehouse and caught the 7 victims off guard. Facing them towards the wall as if they were going to frisk them, they then mowed them down with machine gun fire. Moran was not among them. This attack was enough to scare him off. Having eliminated all opposition on the north side of Chicago, Capone now focused on the south. After a number of killings, his rivals, well, they sued for peace, agreeing to give Al a large slice of the operation. By March of 1929, Al Capone, he was the undisputed king of Chicago, being portrayed to the public as the ultimate gangster. Yet at the same time, he was being read the Riot Act by his peers. For years, the leaders of organized crime had been holding annual meetings to discuss matters of mutual concern. Now the matter of mutual concern, well, it was what to do with Al Capone. Al had attracted a tremendous amount of unwanted attention with the St. Valentine's Day massacre. He was bringing too much unwanted attention as the king, and, well, the time had come for him to be neutralized. The commission decreed that Joseph Aleo, an old enemy of Capone, would be put in place in Chicago to keep Al in check. Capone would also have to cede his gambling operations to the commission. Capone was privately outraged that the commission was muzzling him in this way, but he was also smart enough to know that if he protested, he would quickly be eliminated. He decided to take the advice of the commission and lie low for a while, and what better way to safely lie low than from inside a jail cell? Within 16 hours of coming out of the commission meeting, Capone had been arrested for carrying a concealed weapon. Capone entrusted his $50,000 diamond pinky ring to his attorney with instructions to give it to his brother Ralph, who would become acting head until he returned. He then began a 12-month jail term. When he emerged from his prison cell in March of 1930, Capone discovered that the climate had changed. He had been listed as public enemy #1 by the FBI. The federal government now considered him a menace to society and was prepared to do anything to put him behind bars for good. It was certain that Al was violating the Volstead Act by selling liquor, but they were unable to prove it. Not even Elliot Ness and his untouchables were able to stop Capone. Finally, the FBI decided that their best chance of putting Capone away was to convict him of tax evasion. Capone was used to being cheered when he attended public events, but now that the government was bringing income tax evasion charges against him, crowds, they started booing him. What's worse, his former fail-proof methods of fixing the outcomes of trials, they were having no effect. Al did manage to bribe several jury members, but on the day of the trial, the judge skipped the jury panel. From that moment on, the jurors were sequestered, and they were out of Al's reach. After presenting a damning case which highlighted a life of lavish spending yet virtually no tax payments, the prosecution concluded by reminding the jury that Capone was no Robin Hood. He spent wildly on himself and his cronies, doing nothing to help the poor and the down and out. The judge found him guilty on 3 counts of tax evasion, and on October 24th, 1931, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison. This was the harshest sentence ever handed down for tax evasion. Capone, well, he thought that now his gangland associates would rally to his aid, but he just didn't get it. Maybe his advancing syphilis had something to do with it, but the reality was that he'd been artfully shunted aside at the Atlantic City meeting in 1929. Now, 2 years later, his life was out in the open for all to see, and he had a felony conviction to his name. He was anathema to his former gangland buddies. They ignored him. Capone spent most of his time in an Atlanta prison and then spent the last 3 years of his sentence at Alcatraz. By then, his syphilis had seriously eroded his mental faculties. By the time he died of cardiac arrest on January the 25th, 1947, doctors concluded that he had the mind of a 12-year-old child. And well, that was all for Al Capone. Really hope you enjoyed that one. As always, a review, a rating would be greatly appreciated. Just head over to wherever you get your podcasts, be that Apple Podcasts, iTunes, whatever they call it, or Stitcher, or any of these other ones, and let us know how we're doing. If you want to drop me an email as well, you can always do that, simon@biographics.org. Visit our website, biographics.org. Maybe if you prefer the text version, you can do that. And as always, I'll see you next time. You're listening to the Biographics Podcast. This is an episode that originally aired on YouTube, so there used to be a visual element. There is not anymore. This is just for your listening pleasure. Maybe you're out walking the dog or driving the car where it's not so easy to watch the video version. This is why this audio version exists. If you like us doing this, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. We really do appreciate it, and let's get into this episode. He was the richest man in America, the world at his fingertips, and yes, he was a prisoner to his own dark fears. His achievements were astounding. He created the fastest plane on the planet, was the driving force behind the largest aircraft ever built, and was a pioneer in filmmaking. And yet, he is remembered for the eccentricities that drove him from hero to hermit. In his heyday, he was a romantic figure, with movie starlets flocking to be seen on his arm. And yet, he spent the last 26 years of his life as a recluse, obsessed with cleanliness and controlling every aspect of his environment, even as he sunk deeper and deeper into madness. In this Biographics episode, we enter the strange world of the original eccentric billionaire, Howard Hughes. Of Howard Robard Hughes, it can be a challenge to separate fact from fiction. Even the details of his birth were falsified. Official records give their date as December the 24th, 1905 in Houston, Texas. The reality is that he'd been born 2 months earlier in the oil town of Humble, 100 miles from Texas. From there, the lies, well, they just built upon each other. He was not one of triplets, nor was his mother's sister's illegitimate son or a substitute baby brought in to replace the one who had died. All these fanciful stories were later told by the man himself in order to build upon the aura that surrounded his name. Hughes Sr., known as Beau, a shortened form of his middle name Robards, had been a brilliant scoundrel, loving his way around Joplin, Missouri at the turn of the 19th century. In 1899, he was run out of the town by the furious father of a girl who he tried to seduce. With no other options, the dreamy-eyed larrikin decided to try his hand at the oil business. Making his way to Texas, Beau just happened to be on hands when a 1,000-foot spume of black oil hurtled itself from the ground at Spindletop on January the 10th, 1901. He was among the first to grab claims, buying up lands for a few dollars an acre and selling it only days later for hundreds of dollars. Within a few months, having amassed a small fortune, Beau moved to Houston, where he founded the Texas Oil Field Company, the forerunner to Texaco. Within 6 months, he got married the darkly pretty, seriously hypochondriacal Aline Garno. Aline, she was terrified of small animals and had an insect phobia fueled by an obsession with cleanliness. These traits, well, they were to find full expression in her only son. By the time that Howard Jr., known as Sonny, entered the world in 1905, his father was still chasing oil. Still, he was frustrated, not so much at finding the oil locations, but at the inferior quality of the drilling tools that were available. Finally, out of exasperation, he set his sights on designing a better drill bit. On November the 20th, 1908, he emerged from his study with designs for a bit that contained 168 cutting edges. He had just invented the Hughes tool bit, from which would flow the millions of dollars, which would both enrich and ultimately destroy his son. By the age of 4, it was obvious that Sonny Hughes had inherited the partial deafness that ran in the family. The condition had become progressively worse over Howard's lifetime. As a youngster, it caused him to become isolated and introspective. Now that money was no object, the 8-year-old Hughes was sent to an exclusive private school. He didn't make a very good impression, though, with a head teacher remembering him as an uppity snobbish boor who refused to join in with the other boys, preferring to sit with the girls. Not surprisingly, he soon gained a reputation as a sissy. But the young Hughes, he also gained a reputation as a technical whiz kid. He put together his first wireless radio transmitter when he was only 11 years old. A year later, his picture appeared in the local newspaper, proudly standing next to the first motorized bicycle in Houston, which he had put together from a steam engine. In an effort to get his nervous and timid boy to man up, Bo decided to pack him off to boot camp on the day, which was the Boy Scouts. So, during the 1916 summer recess, Sonny found himself in the middle of the Pocock Mountains in Pike County, Pennsylvania. He was under the tutelage of a grizzled old-timer by the name of General Dan Beard. Surprisingly, the young Hughes, he took to the woodsman life like the proverbial duck to water. He was already quite fit and quickly learned to whistle, perfect Indian signs, and simulate bird calls. He seemed to excel under the military discipline of the camp too. Away from the overprotective gaze of his mother, it seemed he was able to shake off his effeminate nature and show his true colours. In the fall of 1920, a 14-year-old Sonny went with his father to the Harvard-Yale rowing crew races in Connecticut. Hughes Sr. promised to buy his son whatever he wanted if his favourite, Harvard, won the race. When Harvard smashed Yale by 14 seconds, the boy held out his hand in expectation and asked for $5. He then pointed to a sign further up the river advertising rides made the father say that the son had just discovered the true love of his life. He found the experience of flying both exhilarating and liberating. From that moment on, he would be at his most peaceful when he was alone in an airplane flying high above a world he so often tried to escape. By the age of 19, both of Hughes' parents were dead. His mother had died suddenly when he was 16 after suffering complications from an ectopic pregnancy. Bo died less than 2 years later of a heart attack, leaving Hughes Jr. the heir to Hughes Tool Company. He dropped out of college to take control of the company, quickly discovering that he knew nothing about the oil business. He soon hired a self-taught accountant by the name of Noah Dietrich to take full controls. At the same time, Hughes legally declared himself an adult and seized full control of the entire family fortune. Hughes now had the money that he needed to pursue his greatest passions. Those passions, well, they had nothing to do with oil. Instead, they revolved around building and flying airplanes and also making movies in Hollywood. Another of his passions was actually golf. Well, one day, while playing at the Beverly Hills Country Club, he watched as a flying plane flew overhead and tipped his wing at him. Howard was able to track down the flyer and offered to pay him the outrageous sum of $800 per day if he would teach him to fly. The pilot, well, he readily agreed. 2 years later, Hughes was issued his private pilot's license. Despite his growing shyness, Howard was first dated in the glitz and glamour of Hollywood in order to break into the business of a slightly talented director who was constantly to a contract with the parent of the struck picture to Arabian Nights, born in 1927. This gave Hughes the confidence to take on his next challenge, a fusion of his two great loves, flying and movies. Failing to find a director who shared his passion for the skies, Howard decided to go it alone, writing, producing, and directing the world's first true aviation picture. It was called Hell's Angels. This was going to be his magnum opus, and he was prepared to pour in as much money, time, and effort as was needed to create this masterpiece. An air fleet was contracted that was bigger than that of some countries. During aerial filming sequences, Howard's obsessive compulsions led him to fixate on such things as cloud formations. He would scrap valuable minutes of perfectly good footage, forcing his pilots to reshoot until the clouds were just right. One day, Hughes, in an effort to control every aspect of an aerial shoot, he went up in a small scout plane. But no sooner had he ascended than the plane went into a tailspin and crashed into the ground. Howard managed to walk away uninjured, the first of a number of miraculous plane crash escapes. And the news stuntman actually commented that at least he hasn't injured his check-writing arm. So Howard's obsession with perfection meant that the shooting schedule for Hell's Angels got totally out of control. In the meantime, the public had become infatuated with the latest Hollywood innovation, Against everyone's advice, Hughes decided to re-script the movie and reshoot all of the dialogue scenes, this time adding sound. The reshoot proved to be the break of a lifetime for a former bit player named Holly Carpenter. The leading lady in the movie, Greta Gleason, was cut because of her strong Norwegian accent, and Carpenter stepped into the role. She was transformed her into Jean Harlow, the platinum blonde bombshell who became a sensation during the 1930s. Hell's Angels was a box office smash, returning double its production cost of $4 million, which was an exorbitant amount at that time. Unfortunately for Hughes, 3 movie flops followed, but he managed to cash in on the public's obsession with Al Capone by producing the movie Scarface. He's actually got a biographics video on him as well. You can find it in a link in the description below. Alright, so Hughes was one of these guys who always wanted to push the boundaries, and he filmed this movie with all of the violence and all of the obscenities that you'd imagine would be associated with Al Capone. And, not surprisingly, the censors knocked it back, demanding major edits to the movie. And to their surprise, Hughes sued them, and he won. The movie would be released just as Hughes intended.
This is the story of Scarface Tony Carmine, his lust for power, for fancy women.
Don't work too hard. I just finish up tonight. Now I play a while.
So after the release of Scarface, Hughes decided to step back from Hollywood to indulge in his other great passion, and that, of course, was flying. In 1934, he easily won a flying race in Miami. This success fueled his ambitions, inspiring him to set up the Hughes Aircraft Company. He now set out to design and build the world's fastest racing plane. The result of all of his efforts was the H-1, which Hughes flew to a new world speed record of 352 miles per hour on August the 18th, 1935. By 1938, Hughes was intent on achieving another world first, the fastest flight around the world. In a modified Lockheed 14, he took to the skies with a hand-picked crew and set off from New York. 16 hours and 38 minutes later, they landed in Paris, then on to Moscow, and then on to Siberia. 3 days, 19 hours and 14 minutes after setting out, they were back in New York. Hughes, he was hailed as a conquering hero, and for 3 days, the painfully shy adventurer endured ticker-tape parades and receptions in New York, Chicago, Washington, and Houston. In 1940, Hughes moved into commercial aviation by grabbing a controlling share of Trans World Airlines, or TWA. A short time later, the US government they wanted Hughes aircraft to supply plane parts, artillery shells, and cannon barrels to help support the war effort in Europe. 2 years later, with America well and truly immersed in the conflict, Hughes was contracted to design and build a massive flying boat in order to overcome the German U-boat menace that was causing serious problems for US transport vessels. So while doing the testing and design for these projects, Hughes was involved in his fourth plane crash. He was testing a Sikorsky S-43 amphibian aircraft on Lake Mead, Nevada. The plane, it went down into the frigid waters and actually killed a CAA inspector and an engineer who were also on board the vessel. Hughes once again managed to walk away, though he did receive a large gash to the top of his head. Around this time that Hughes began to exhibit patterns of behavior that seemed odd to onlookers. Compulsive hand-washing to avoid germs, checking and rechecking his work, and always seeking symmetry, constantly trying to make things perfect. All classic signs of OCD were seen as symptoms of a deteriorating mind. This was hardly a good time for whispers of insanity. With his business empire rapidly expanding and his business contracts imposing weighty demands, Hughes was facing stresses and pressures from all directions. 2 huge contracts for the XF-11 reconnaissance plane and the HK-1 Spruce Goose were both over budget, and they were overdue. Most of the delays, they were due to Hughes's incessant tinkering and his insistence on being the test pilot for both planes. And, well, it was this insistence which brought about his closest call yet. On July the 7th, 1946, Hughes took the XF-11 for its first ever test flight over the Los Angeles Basin. Now, for the first 45 minutes, this plane functioned perfectly. Then, suddenly, propeller malfunction caused the plane to plummet into the ground. Desperately wrestling with the controls, Hughes hoped to land on a fairway at the Los Angeles Country Club. Instead, he plunged through the roof of a nearby house. It was one crash that he wasn't able to walk away from. He was extracted from the wreckage as it went up in flames and rushed to the hospital.
After ripping the corner from two homes in Beverly Hills, California, the plane finally plunged into this house. The force of the impact virtually wrecked the building and caused the plane to catch fire.
He suffered severe head trauma and multiple burns along with fractures to his neck. These injuries were going to cause him suffering for the rest of his life. To control his pain, he started taking drugs. You can identify 3 of them: codeine, Valium, and Emperor. These are drugs that he took daily for the next 30 years. Still, the pain and head injuries, they affected his behavior, causing his OCD to spin out of control. Long before his addiction to painkillers, Howard Hughes, well, he had another addiction, and that was to women. When he came to Hollywood in 1925, he had a wife and an enormous sexual appetite. The wife, Bella, soon tired of his infidelities, filing for divorce in 1929. The sexual appetite, very well, it remained and was satisfied with a list of Hollywood conquests that would include such stars as Jean Peters, Rita Hayworth, Ava Gardner, Lana Turner, and Katharine Hepburn. Hughes, well, he was obsessed with the female form, and this was actually the inspiration for his most controversial film, The Outlaw. Set during the Old West, the movie was a showcase for the voluptuous Jane Russell, with Hughes personally ensuring that her dresses were cut low enough to accentuate her size 38D bust. Once again, the censors were outraged, but Hughes, well, he was laughing all the way to the bank. By the mid-1940s, Hughes's health issues were impacting upon his increasingly complicated business empire. In addition to his ownership of TWA, the Hughes Tool Company, he now also owns the RKO movie studio. At the same time, he was building a huge aerospace company to develop spy technology for the military. In 1947, the pressure on Hughes was ramped up several notches when he was subpoenaed to appear before Congress regarding alleged improprieties in his government contracts. In a commanding performance with the TV cameras rolling, he strongly denied profiteering from the war effort.
I put the sweat of my life into this thing. I have my reputation rolled up in it. And I have stated several times that if it's a failure, I'll probably leave this country and never come back, and I mean it.
It is sort of ironic that this congressional appearance, his most confident, strong, and dominant public outing, was also the last time that the public would see Howard Hughes. The brilliant, fearless, visible millionaire, well, he was transforming into a mysterious, invisible Hughes. The 53-year-old Hughes was now completely intent on retreating from society. The symptoms of his undiagnosed obsessive-compulsive disorder were by now all too apparent. He refused to shake hands or touch door handles. Instructions to his aides were repeated in meticulous detail, and he flew into violent rages when things were not exactly as he had commanded. Those who worked for Hughes began calling him the old man. He became seriously concerned that he was going insane. The FBI, who were actually keeping tabs on him, noted in 1957 that he was acting like a screwball paranoiac. They added that he could even be capable of murder. Then, seemingly totally out of the blue, Hughes declared that he was going to marry one of the many starlets that he had been seeing, Jean Peters. Many people believe that Hughes decided to get hitched so that his aides would no longer be able to have him committed to an asylum. Less than a year after marrying Peters in a Nevada hotel room, Hughes descended into one of the most bizarre episodes of his life. He told his aides that he wanted to view some movies at a studio on Sunset Boulevard. He didn't leave that darkened screening room for more than 4 months.
He has to open the bag with his right hand and hold the bag out to me at a 45-degree angle so I may reach into the bag and out without touching the paper.
During this time, his diet consisted of chocolate bars and milk, and he spent his days and nights sitting naked in a chair, staring at the screen. During this time, Hughes communicated with his aides by scribbling on a yellow legal pad. Instructions included not looking at him and not speaking to him unless spoken to first. Over those 4 months at the studio, his personal hygiene rapidly deteriorated, even as his germ obsession intensified. When he finally emerged from the screening room in the spring of 1958, Hughes was an unkempt, ragged, and pathetic mess. Following this, he pretty much immediately checked into the Beverly Hills Hotel, another place you're only supposed to stay on a temporary basis, but Hughes ended up staying in there for years. Here, he reverted to his screening room habits, sitting naked in the dark hour after hour. Business dealings were conducted by telephone and through his handwritten instructions. During this time, his drug use also escalated as he fought continuous pain, now injecting himself with morphine to supplement his megadoses of codeine and Valium. In 1966, conducting negotiations completely by telephone, Hughes sold his controlling share in TWA. This made him a billionaire and the richest man in America. But rather than simply sit on his fortune, Hughes, despite his pathetic physical condition, set his sights on conquering a brand new frontier. And that frontier, well, it would be Las Vegas. His first move was to relocate to the penthouse suite of the Desert Inn, where he could continue his bizarre lifestyle without interruption. He then began buying up the city, starting with the very hotel that he was living in. His investments included a local TV station, which he bought so that he could demand they play the movies that he wanted to watch. Now, by 1970, he was a prisoner of his own design, and then, as if things weren't crazy enough already, he suddenly left the Desert Inn without warning. Many in his entourage, they thought that he'd been abducted, but 3 weeks later, he turned up in the Bahamas. From there, he announced that he was turning the day-to-day operations of his empire over to a group of Mormon aides. In 1972, Hughes relocated to a hotel room in London. He left the room only once to go flying, but this was like no flight he had ever taken before. Climbing into the cockpit, he took off all of his clothes and flew around London in the nude. Following what would be his final flight at the helm, Hughes's condition, well, it rapidly deteriorated. He took a fall in his London hotel room, which increased his reliance on painkillers and, unfortunately, took away his ability to walk. Things, well, they only went downhill from here. As if by design, Hughes's last hours were spent in the air. He was traveling to Houston to receive medical treatment. His emancipated body finally breathed its last breath on April 5th, 1976. The world, it was shocked when the autopsy pictures revealed the terrible condition of his body, the result of undiagnosed OCD, multiple severe head injuries, and 30 years of largely self-imposed neglect. It was a sad end for a truly brilliant man.
So I really hope you enjoyed that one. As I said at the beginning, it'd be great if you left us a rating or review wherever you get podcasts. That would be cool. Maybe you're driving right now. Just remember to do that when you get home. That would be really cool of you. If you want to say hi to me on social media, I'm at Simon Whistler. That's just at Simon Whistler, no dot or anything in there. On Twitter and Instagram and, you know, maybe some other places in the future. That depends on when you're listening to this, but it'll always be at Simon Whistler. So go check that out. And as always, I'll see you next time. Hi and welcome to the Biographics Podcast. I am your host, Simon Whistler, and in today's episode, we've got another one we've taken from our YouTube channel. If there are any sort of weird abnormalities, because this is the taking of a video from YouTube and the rebroadcasting of the video in a podcast form, if there's anything weird and funky, that's probably just because it was intended for a video audience first, but hopefully you will enjoy it all the same. Let's roll into today's episode.
He has come down through history as America's first serial killer, the incarnation of pure evil. He was the first of a new breed of American celebrity, the handsome, debonair, and super intelligent mass murderer. His legends, fueled by his own insatiable appetite for exaggeration, would turn him into a monster, the arch fiend of the age, and the greatest